December 2nd, 1944. Captain Charles MacDonald stood at the edge of a frozen field in Germany, 22 years old, staring at two things that wouldn't agree with each other, the map in his hands. And the village of Marode, 800 yards away. His orders were simple: take the village by dawn, clear the Germans out, hold the ground. The map showed one road. A single dirt track cutting through open fields, straight into Marode's western edge. MacDonald looked at that road. Then he looked at the German machine gun positions dug into the tree line on either side. Every officer who'd tried the direct approach was dead, or bleeding out in an aid station somewhere behind the lines. The wind cut across the field. December in the Hürtgen Forest. 20 degrees Fahrenheit, ice crusting on every surface. MacDonald's company, I had 147 men left. They'd started the month with 200. He turned to his first sergeant, a Wisconsin dairy farmer named Boger, 32 years old, 3 campaigns under his belt, North Africa, Sicily, now this frozen hell. Sergeant, MacDonald said, what do you see that this map doesn't show? Boger studied the terrain, not the paper, the actual ground. He pointed, not at the road, at a slight depression running parallel to it, maybe 3 feet deep, filled with frozen reeds and winter-dead vegetation. That, sir, Boger said, that's not on any map. The briefing had come down from battalion 6 hours earlier. MacDonald remembered every word. Company, I will advance on Marode along Route 47. Secure the western approaches. Establish defensive positions before 0600 hours. Route 47, the death road. The Germans had been holding Marode for 3 weeks. They knew every angle, every approach, every killing field. Their maps were better than the American maps. Pre-war German military surveys, precise, detailed, every strategic road marked and catalogued. Those maps told them exactly where the Americans would attack, and the Americans had proven them right, every single time. November 28th, Company K tried the road, 37 casualties in 40 minutes. November 30th, Company L tried a flanking maneuver through the tree line. German mortars had the coordinates pre-registered. 53 casualties. December 1st, Battalion tried a coordinated assault, all 3 company-size elements. The Germans didn't even seem surprised. Now it was Company I's turn. MacDonald had spent 4 months in combat. Long enough to know when an order would get his men killed. He spread the map on the hood of a jeep. His platoon leaders gathered around, steam rising from their breath in the freezing air. 2nd Lieutenant Morrison, 23, history teacher before the war. 2nd Lieutenant de Haven, 21, ranch kid from Wyoming. 2nd Lieutenant Winacker, 24, the oldest, the steadiest. MacDonald traced the road with his finger. They'll expect us here, he said. Same approach everyone else tried. Morrison nodded. Machine guns have interlocking fields of fire. We'd be cut down before we made it halfway. Artillery support? De Haven asked. MacDonald shook his head. Battalion's got nothing to spare. We're on our own. The wind picked up. Snow beginning to fall, light dry, the kind that squeaks under boots. Winacker studied the map, then looked at the actual terrain. Back and forth. Map, ground, sir, he said slowly. That depression Sergeant Boger pointed out. It runs almost parallel to the road. MacDonald looked. The map showed flat, open ground, nothing more. But the actual terrain told a different story. It's a drainage system, Boger said. Agricultural, for the fields. Germans built it before the war. Deep enough for cover? MacDonald asked. Maybe. 3 feet, 4 in some places. Wide enough to move troops? Single file. Slow going. Morrison frowned. If the Germans know about it. They don't, Boger interrupted. It's not military infrastructure. It's civilian. Farm drainage. Not worth marking on a military map. Silence. The sound of distant artillery. American. German. Impossible to tell anymore. MacDonald looked at his watch. 1400 hours. 4 hours of daylight left. He made a decision that would save some of his men's lives and cost others everything. We scout it, he said. Now, full recon. If it works, we use it. If it doesn't, we follow orders and take the road. Sergeant Frank Gonçalves led the scout team. 26 years old, California, Portuguese family, 3 generations of loggers and woodsmen. Before the war, he'd tracked deer through the Sierra Nevada. Read terrain the way other men read newspapers. He took 3 men, Morrison's best soldiers, Private First Class Carlson, Hunter from Montana, Corporal Wright, surveyor's assistant in civilian life, Private Diaz. Grew up in the New Mexico high desert, could navigate by stars and shadows. They moved out at 14:30 hours. MacDonald watched them disappear into the drainage system. One moment visible. The next, gone, swallowed by the earth. The depression ran northeast, roughly parallel to Route 47, angling toward Merud's southern edge instead of the western approach the map designated. MacDonald waited. The cold seeped through his boots, through his coat, through everything. He thought about the men under his command, high school kids and college boys and farmers and mechanics. None of them asked to be here, none of them trained for this specific frozen nightmare, but they trusted him. That was the weight that kept him awake at night. At 16:20 hours the scout team returned. Gonsalves's face was unreadable, ice in his eyebrows, mud caked on his uniform. "Well?" MacDonald asked. Gonsalves pulled out a hand-drawn sketch. Not a military map, something rougher, more immediate. "It works, sir. The drainage system runs for about 600 yards, angles southeast. Comes out but behind the German defensive line." He pointed to marks on his sketch. "Here's where we'd enter. Tree cover shields the entrance from German observation. Here's the depth, varies between 3 and 5 feet. Wide enough for single file, but we'd have to crouch. Obstacles, ice, standing water in some sections. One culvert we'd have to crawl through, German positions. They're dug in watching the road and the main tree line. Standard doctrine. Nobody's watching the drainage ditch because it's not on their maps." MacDonald studied the sketch. Then he looked at the actual terrain again. The ditch wasn't invisible. You could see it if you knew what to look for. But German maps didn't show it. American maps didn't show it. It was civilian infrastructure, agricultural engineering, below the threshold of military relevance, unless you were desperate enough to look beyond what the maps told you was important. "Risks?" MacDonald asked. Gonsalves didn't hesitate. "If they spot us in the ditch, we're trapped, can't spread out, can't maneuver. Single file means if the front stops, everyone stops. If we take fire, casualties pile up fast. But if they don't spot us? We come out behind their line. Complete surprise." Morrison spoke up. "Sir, this isn't in the operation order. Battalion expects us on Route 47. MacDonald knew. The US Army ran on orders and doctrine and coordinated planning. Deviating meant risk, not just tactical risk, career risk. But following the plan meant sending his men down a road where other companies had already bled out. He looked at his watch. 16:30 hours. 90 minutes of daylight remaining. Decision time. MacDonald called his platoon leaders together, plus Sergeant Boger, plus Gonsalves. 6 men, 6 different opinions, probably. Options, MacDonald said. "Give them to me straight." Morrison went first. "The history teacher. The one who thought in terms of doctrine and precedent. We follow the operation order, attack down Route 47. Request smoke cover, move fast, accept casualties, take the objective." De Haven, the ranch kid, shook his head. "That's suicide. We've seen what happens on that road. Winokur, the steady one, split the force, faint on the road with 1 platoon. Main effort through the drainage ditch with 2 platoons. Gonsalves, all or nothing, full company through the ditch, hit them where they're not looking." Boger, "Sir, in North Africa we learned, go where they don't expect, but only if you commit fully. Half measures get you killed both ways." MacDonald listened. The wind had picked up. Snow falling harder now, visibility dropping. He thought about the German commanders across that field, professional soldiers, trained in the finest military tradition in Europe, confident in their maps and their defensive doctrine. They expected the Americans to follow the roads, to attack where the maps said attacks should come from, because that's what military science taught, that's what the maps showed. But MacDonald's men weren't Prussian officers. They were farmers and mechanics and hunters. They trusted their eyes more than paper. "Here's what we do," MacDonald said. 2 platoons through the ditch. "Winokur, Morrison, your men. Move after dark. Full noise discipline. Navigate by Gonsalves's sketch." He pointed at the map. "De Haven, your platoon stays here. At 0530 you make noise on Route 47. Draw their attention. Make them think we're coming down the road. Don't commit. Just fix their attention. When the main element hits them from the flank, you advance and link up." Silence. Then Morrison, "Sir, if this goes wrong, it's on me," MacDonald said. "I'll write it up in the after-action report. My decision, my responsibility." Boger nodded slowly. "When do we move?" MacDonald checked his watch. 1700 hours. Full dark is at 1830. We step off at 1900. That gives us time to prep and brief every squad leader. No one moves until they understand the route and the timing. He looked at each man. This works once, maybe. They'll adapt after. But tonight, we have one chance to do something they won't expect. The meeting broke up. Officers moved to their platoons. MacDonald stood alone for a moment, 22 years old. 4 months in combat, about to gamble with the lives of 98 men. He pulled out his own copy of the operation order, the one that said advance via Route 47. He'd follow part of it, the objective, take Marode, but not the method, because the map showed a road, but the ground showed a ditch. And right now, in this frozen German forest, ground truth mattered more than paper doctrine. What MacDonald didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this moment represented something larger than one battle. It was a collision of military philosophies. The German General Staff had spent centuries perfecting the art of war, military maps, strategic infrastructure, professional officers trained in academies where doctrine was refined and tested. Those maps showed roads, railways, strategic positions, fortifications. They showed what military science deemed important. Agricultural drainage ditches? Not relevant. Civilian engineering? Below notice. The Americans came from a different tradition. Many of MacDonald's soldiers grew up on farms. They understood drainage systems, irrigation channels, the hidden infrastructure that made land productive. Others had been hunters, trappers, park rangers. Men who navigated by reading terrain, not maps. They'd learned, long before they put on uniforms, that the land didn't care about what maps showed. It was what it was. And you either read it correctly or you got lost. Now, in December 1944, that cultural difference was about to become tactical advantage. The Germans had better maps, but the Americans had better scouts. The Germans had superior doctrine, but the Americans had adaptive minds. The question was, would one night, one ditch, one desperate gamble be enough? MacDonald didn't know. But in 90 minutes, when full darkness fell and his men started moving through that drainage system, he'd find out. The map said it was impossible. The ground said otherwise. And in war, the ground always has the final word. 1900 hours, full darkness, 98 men lined up at the edge of the drainage ditch, 2 platoons, Winnackers and Morrisons, no talking, hand signals only. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that makes metal stick to skin, that turns breath to ice crystals in the air. MacDonald stood at the front of the column with gonsalves. Behind them, the line stretched back into darkness. Every 5th man carried a Bayar, Browning automatic rifle. Every man carried extra ammunition, grenades. Rations for 3 days, though nobody expected to be out there that long. They'd stripped everything that could make noise. No canteens rattling against web gear, no loose equipment. Even dog tags wrapped in tape to keep them silent. Gonsalves looked at MacDonald. MacDonald nodded. They dropped into the ditch. The world changed. Above ground, open fields, distant tree lines, the geometry of military maps. Below ground, a different war. Narrow walls of frozen earth, reeds and dead vegetation, ice-crusted water pooling in the low spots. 3 feet deep in most places, 4 feet in some sections, just enough to move hunched over, just enough to stay below the sight lines. Gonsalves moved first, compass in one hand, his sketch map in the other. 20 paces, stop, listen. 20 more paces, stop, check compass heading. Behind him, 97 men followed in single file. The pace was agonizing. In a normal march across open ground, infantry could cover a mile in 20 minutes. Here, in this frozen ditch, they managed 200 yards in an hour. Every step a calculation. Where to place your boot, how to avoid splashing in the standing water, how to keep your rifle from scraping the ditch walls. MacDonald was 5th in line, close enough to see Gonsalves, far enough back to control the column. The sounds were all wrong. No engine noise, no artillery rumble, just the whisper of 98 men trying to move silently through frozen terrain, ice cracking underfoot. The rustle of dead vegetation, breathing, always breathing. At 20-30 hours, they reached the first obstacle. A culvert, concrete pipe, maybe 4 feet in diameter, half filled with ice and mud. Gonsalves crawled through first. The men watched him disappear into the darkness. Seconds passed. More seconds. Then a hand signal from the other side. One by one they crawled through. MacDonald went through 6th. The culvert was tight, claustrophobic, ice-cold water soaking through his uniform. Total darkness, just the feel of concrete above and mud below. He came out the other side gasping. 92 men, still to go. The column stopped, waiting, each man crawling through in turn. MacDonald checked his watch, 20-45 hours. They'd covered maybe 400 yards. Still 200 to go before they reached the position behind German lines. He looked up at the night sky. Cloud cover, no moon, no stars. Perfect conditions for what they were attempting. Terrible conditions for navigation, but Gonsalves kept moving, reading the terrain by feel, by the angle of the ditch walls, by landmarks only he could see in the darkness. At 2200 hours they heard German voices. Close, maybe 50 yards. The entire column froze. MacDonald could hear them clearly. Conversation in German, the sound of men at ease, guards probably. Rotating watch, confident in their positions. Why wouldn't they be confident? The Americans always came down the road. Gonsalves turned back, looked at MacDonald, the question in his eyes, keep moving or hold position. MacDonald pointed forward, keep moving, slower now, even more careful. The German voices faded behind them. At 2:30 hours, Gonsalves signalled a halt. MacDonald crawled forward to his position. Gonsalves pointed. Ahead the ditch curved slightly right, then ended. Beyond that endpoint, open ground, maybe 30 yards. Then the southern edge of Marode, behind the German defensive line, exactly where they needed to be. MacDonald looked at his watch, 2,330 hours, 6 hours until dawn, 4.5 hours until de Haven's platoon would create their diversion on Route 47. Time to get into position. He passed word back down the column. Winacker's platoon would deploy on the right, Morrison's on the left. Establish firing positions, wait for the signal. The men moved out of the ditch one at a time, low crawls, 30 yards of open ground. Above them stars began to break through the cloud cover, just enough light to see silhouettes. Not enough for the Germans to spot movement if the Americans stayed low. It took an hour to get everyone in position. By 30 hours, December 3rd, 98 American soldiers lay in the frozen grass behind German lines. Waiting, MacDonald settled into his position, Morrison on his left, Winacker on his right. Sergeant Boga somewhere back in the column with the reserve element. The cold was relentless. It found every gap in clothing, every exposed inch of skin. Men shivered, teeth chattered. No way to prevent it, but nobody moved, nobody made unnecessary sound. They'd trained for this, not in any manual, not in any classroom. But in 4 months of combat they'd learned what separated living soldiers from dead ones: patience, silence, the ability to endure cold and fear and uncertainty. MacDonald thought about his men. Boys, really, most of them younger than him. How many would see tomorrow? He pushed the thought away. Focus on the mission, execute the plan, deal with the cost later. Always later. The stars wheeled overhead. Hours crawled past. At 0400 hours, snow began falling again. Light, quiet, covering everything with white. MacDonald checked his watch for the 100th time. 4:30 hours. 1 hour until de Haven's diversion. 1 hour until it all began. Giro 5:30 hours. The first sound was American. Machine gun fire from the direction of Route 47. De Haven's platoon. Right on time. The Germans reacted instantly. MacDonald could hear them shouting, running to their positions facing the road, where they expected the attack, where every attack had come from, exactly as planned. MacDonald raised his hand. 98 men tensed. He dropped his hand. The attack began with grenades. 30 yards away, German soldiers were scrambling into defensive positions, their backs to MacDonald's men, all their attention focused on the road. The grenades went high, arsing through the pre-dawn darkness. 4 seconds of flight time, then detonation, explosion, screaming, confusion. Move! MacDonald shouted. Winacker's platoon on the right, Morrison's on the left. Rushing forward through the smoke and chaos, the Germans tried to turn, tried to reorient their defense. Too late, too slow. American riflemen were already among them. Close range, brutal. Fast. The firefight lasted 11 minutes, not the clean surgical precision of a training exercise, not the heroic charges of propaganda films. War in its rawest form, muzzle flashes in darkness. Men screaming, the crack of rifles and the stutter of machine guns, grenades detonating, smoke and confusion and fear. MacDonald moved through it, leading, directing, trying to maintain control in chaos. A German soldier appeared from a bunker entrance, young, maybe 19. Terrified, he raised his hands. "Kamerad!" he shouted. Comrade, the universal word of surrender. An American corporal took him prisoner. Shoved him toward the rear. More Germans emerged, surrendering. Their defensive position had been perfect for defending the road, useless against an attack from behind. At 0541 hours, the firing stopped. Silence, sudden and shocking, then sounds, wounded men crying out, in English, in German. Medics moved forward. MacDonald counted his men, Morrison doing the same, Winacker checking his platoon. The butcher's bill came in piece by piece. 2 killed, both from Morrison's platoon, Corporal Stevens and Private Reardon. 11 wounded, 4 serious enough for evacuation, 7 could stay with the unit. 31 German prisoners, 12 German dead. The southern edge of Merode was theirs. MacDonald stood in the centre of what had been a German defensive position, professionally constructed, well sitted, properly camouflaged. It should have been impregnable, but it faced the wrong direction, because the maps said Americans would come from the west, and the Germans trusted their maps. At 061 hours, de Haven's platoon linked up. They'd taken casualties in their diversionary attack, 3 wounded, but they'd done their job, fixed German attention while the main attack went in from behind. By 0700 hours, full daylight, Company I held the southern portion of Merode, mission accomplished, but MacDonald felt no triumph, just exhaustion, and the weight of 2 more names to write letters about. Stevens had been a mechanic from Detroit, 20 years old. Reardon, a farm boy from Iowa, 19. They'd trusted MacDonald to lead them. He'd led them through a drainage ditch and into a firefight. They'd done everything right, and died anyway, because that's war, not the part they show in newsreels, the part that makes old men wake up at 3 in the morning, decades later, remembering names. What happened at Merode wasn't about American bravery versus German cowardice. Both sides had brave men, professional soldiers, well trained. The difference was in how they'd been trained to think. German military doctrine, refined over centuries, emphasized precision, planning, centralized decision-making. Squad leaders waited for orders from platoon leaders waited for orders from company commanders. Company commanders executed the plan handed down from battalion. It was efficient when conditions matched the plan. When the Americans appeared from an unexpected direction, German junior leaders froze. They needed new orders, new instructions. But their company commander was focused on the diversion at Route 47. By the time he realized the real attack was coming from behind, MacDonald's men were already in the position. The American system was different, messier, less precise, but adaptive. MacDonald had given his platoon leaders an objective: take the southern edge of Merode. He'd given them a method: use the drainage ditch to approach from behind, but the details, how each squad moved, where each fire team positioned itself, that was up to sergeants and corporals. Men like Gonsalves and Boga, men who'd grown up solving problems, fixing broken tractors, tracking deer through unfamiliar terrain, finding ways to make things work. That flexibility came from American culture, from a frontier heritage that valued practical problem solving over theoretical perfection. It wasn't taught in a classroom. It was learned on farms and ranches and in the workshops where these men had grown up. Now, in a frozen German village, that cultural difference had become tactical advantage, but advantages don't last. The Germans would learn, adapt, change their defensive doctrine, but learning takes time. And in December 1944, time was the one thing the German army didn't have. Merode wasn't unique. Up and down the Hürtgen Forest front, other American units were making similar discoveries. December 5, 1944. The 28th Infantry Division, attacking toward the town of Schmidt, found a hiking trail marked by pre-war German Forestry Service. Not on military maps, used it to bypass German roadblocks. December 8th, the 78th Infantry Division recruited a local Belgian guide, old man named Franz Krebs, 73 years old. He'd lived in the forest his entire life. He showed them logging roads and hunters' paths that existed nowhere on paper. December 12th, a reconnaissance platoon from the 9th Infantry Division discovered that German maps showed a stream as uncrossable. They waded across in 30 seconds, water only 3 feet deep. The Germans had trusted the map notation, never checked. The pattern was clear. American infantry, many of them from rural backgrounds, trusted direct observation over theoretical doctrine. They looked at terrain and saw what was actually there, not what maps told them should be there. At division headquarters, intelligence officers began compiling reports, after action summaries from company and battalion commanders, all noting the same thing. Local terrain knowledge trumped standard military cartography, but there was no formal doctrine change, no official recognition from higher command. Instead, information spread informally. Company commanders talking to each other, sergeants sharing techniques, the same way farmers shared crop rotation methods or mechanics traded repair tricks, word of mouth, practical knowledge, veteran to rookie. MacDonald found himself in demand, called to battalion headquarters, asked to brief other company commanders. Tell us how you took Merode, they said, he explained. The drainage ditch, the night movement. The attack from behind. Some officers listened, nodded, started thinking differently about terrain. Others dismissed it. "You got lucky," one captain said. "Try that again and the Germans will be waiting." He was half right. The Germans were learning. By mid-December, German commanders across the Hürtgen sector had figured out the pattern. General Rudolf von Gersdorf, chief of staff for the German 7th Army, read the intelligence reports. American infantry units repeatedly attacking from unexpected directions, using terrain features not marked on standard military maps. Von Gersdorf was a professional, career officer, old enough to have fought in the First World War. He understood what was happening. The Americans were adapting faster than German doctrine could adjust. He issued new orders: mobile defense, maintain reserves to respond to threats from any direction. Don't assume Americans will follow predicted routes. Good orders. But by December 1944, the German army lacked the resources to execute them. Stretched thin across multiple fronts, fuel shortages, ammunition shortages. Experienced troops being bled away in constant combat. The kind of flexible defense von Gersdorf envisioned required manpower and mobility the Wehrmacht no longer possessed. Some German units tried to adapt. Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, began using irregular approaches themselves. These elite troops had the training and initiative to match American tactics, but there were too few of them, and they were being thrown into desperate defensive battles where tactical innovation couldn't overcome strategic collapse. The war was being decided by factors far larger than who could read terrain better. But in individual battles, in specific villages and forest sections, those tactical advantages saved American lives and cost German positions. December 15th, 1944. Company I pulled back from a road for a 3-day rest. They'd held the village for 13 days, repelled 2 German counterattacks, absorbed replacements to bring the unit back up to strength. 98 men had started the attack on December 3rd. 64 walked out on December 15th. 2 killed in the initial assault, Stevens and Reardon. 4 killed in the first counterattack on December 6th. 9 killed in the second counterattack on December 10th. 19 wounded seriously enough for evacuation. The replacements arrived on December 8th, fresh from training, 18 and 19 years old, wide-eyed and terrified. They didn't know the terrain, didn't know the tactics, didn't know each other. The veterans tried to teach them fast, because in combat, learning curves were measured in blood. MacDonald sat in a bombed-out farmhouse that served as company headquarters, writing letters. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Stevens, dear Mr. and Mrs. Reardon." The letters all said the same things. "Your son died bravely. He was a credit to his unit. His sacrifice will not be forgotten. All true, all inadequate." How do you tell parents that their son died because of decisions you made? That you chose to send 98 men through a drainage ditch and some of them didn't come back? That it worked, that the tactic saved lives overall, that if you'd gone down Route 47, the casualties would have been worse. Does that math make it better? MacDonald didn't know. He was 22 years old, a college student 8 months ago, now writing death letters in a German farmhouse. Sergeant Boger found him there. "Sir, you need to eat something." MacDonald looked up. "In a minute." "No, sir, now. You haven't eaten in 12 hours. Boger set down a tin of rations, heated somehow, probably over a trench lighter." MacDonald stared at it. "I got Stevens killed," he said quietly. Boger sat down. The Wisconsin dairy farmer, the North Africa veteran. The man who'd seen more death than any 22-year-old should have to see. "No, sir," Boger said. "The Germans got Stevens killed. You gave him a better chance than he would have had going down that road. Reardon too, and Thompson, and DiMaggio. And 64 men who are still alive because you found a way through." Boger interrupted. "Sir, with respect, you don't get to take credit for the successes and then deny responsibility for the costs. It's both or neither. This is how you lead infantry in combat. You make the best decisions you can with what you know. Some men live, some don't. You carry all of them. The living and the dead." MacDonald looked at the older man. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you keep making decisions when you know some of them will get people killed?" Boger was quiet for a moment. "You remember why you're here," he finally said. "We didn't start this war. We didn't invade anybody's country. We're here to finish it, to get it over with so we can go home. Every German position we take is one step closer to that. Every smart tactic that reduces our casualties is one more mother who gets her son back. You found a smart tactic, sir. The drainage ditch. The off-map approach. That's going to save lives in other units too. Word's spreading. He stood up. Now eat. Because tomorrow we might be back on the line, and your men need you sharp. MacDonald ate. The food had no taste, just fuel. Outside, snow continued to fall on Merode, on the frozen fields, on the drainage ditch where 98 men had moved through darkness, on the graves of the men who hadn't made it out. The thing about war is that it's the world's harshest teacher. Fail a test in school, you get a bad grade. Fail a test in combat, people die. That creates pressure. Intense, immediate. It forces innovation, not because soldiers are brilliant strategists, but because they're desperate survivors. MacDonald didn't wake up one morning with a genius plan to revolutionize infantry tactics. He looked at a map that told him to do one thing, looked at terrain that showed him another option, and chose the option that might get fewer of his men killed. Practical, pragmatic, desperate, that's how most tactical innovations actually happen, not in war colleges or staff meetings, but in frozen fields with young officers trying to keep their soldiers alive. The Americans had an advantage here. Their military culture, shaped by a frontier heritage, valued practical problem solving. If the manual said one thing but common sense said another, you went with common sense. German military culture, shaped by Prussian tradition, valued precision and doctrine. Trust the system, follow the plan, the general staff knows best. Both approaches had merit. In open warfare, with clear sight lines and mobile formations, German doctrine was devastatingly effective. The early war blitzkrieg campaigns proved that, but in close terrain, in forests and villages, where individual squad leaders had to make split-second decisions, the American system had the edge, because sergeants like Gonsalves and Boga didn't wait for permission to solve problems. They saw an obstacle and figured out how to get around it. That wasn't better training, it was different culture. And in the Hürtgen Forest, in December 1944, that cultural difference was keeping American soldiers alive. But cultures can change, learn, adapt. The Germans were learning. By late December, they'd adjusted defensive tactics, positioned observers to watch unconventional approaches, maintained mobile reserves. The easy victories were over. The drainage ditch tactic that worked at Merode wouldn't work the same way twice. But the principle remained. Look at the ground, not just the map. Trust what you can see, not just what you were told. Adapt to conditions. Don't force conditions to match doctrine. That principle would outlast the battle. Outlast the war. It would show up in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq and Afghanistan, because ground truth never changes, only the soldiers walking that ground, and whether they're smart enough to see what's actually there. February 1945. Captain Charles MacDonald sat in a rear area hospital, staring at feet that didn't work properly anymore. Trench foot, the infantryman's plague, 3 months in frozen mud, boots that never dried. Feet that turned purple, then black. The doctors said he'd recover, eventually, but his combat days were over. He was 22 years old. Company I was still in the line. Under a new commander now, taking casualties, holding ground, doing the work that infantry does. MacDonald had led them through Merode, through 2 more villages after that. Through Christmas in frozen foxholes and New Year's under German artillery, he'd brought 98 men through a drainage ditch on December 2nd. By the time they pulled him out on February 8th, 34 of those 98 were casualties, 15 killed in action, 19 wounded so badly they'd never return to duty. Tactical innovation had given some of them a few more weeks of life. War had taken them anyway. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Yes, the off-map approaches reduced casualties compared to frontal assaults. Division intelligence estimated maybe 20% fewer losses when units use unconventional routes. 20%. That meant for every 5 men who would have died going down Route 47, 1 survived because someone found a drainage ditch, or a hiking trail, or a logging road. 1 in 5. Was that success? MacDonald didn't know. He knew the names of the men who'd lived, and the names of the men who hadn't. And 22 years old was too young to carry that kind of arithmetic. But there was no choice about carrying it. That's what leadership meant. In March, still recovering, MacDonald received orders, temporary assignment to 2nd Infantry Division Historical Section. His job, document the Hürtgen campaign, lessons learned, tactical innovations, what worked, what didn't. He wrote reports. Dry, official, military language. Units employing terrain features not depicted on standard military maps achieved tactical surprise in 23 documented instances between November 1944 and January 1945. Local civilian knowledge proved valuable tactical asset in 17 separate engagements. Recommendation: infantry reconnaissance elements should conduct ground surveys independent of map-based planning. Good recommendations. They'd save lives. Maybe, in future battles, future wars, if anyone read them, if anyone remembered. But MacDonald knew how institutions worked. The lessons that seemed so clear in February 1945, bought with blood in frozen forests, would fade. New officers would arrive, trained in peacetime, learning doctrine from manuals, not from muddy fields. They'd trust their maps, their GPS systems, their technology. And they'd forget that ground truth matters more than paper truth until they learned it again, the hard way, the only way such lessons are ever really learned. Here's what the history books would say about the Hürtgen Forest: costly American victory, 33,000 casualties, difficult terrain, determined German resistance, strategic objective achieved but at heavy price. True. All of it, but incomplete. The books wouldn't mention the drainage ditch at Marode, or the hiking trail that the 28th Division used near Schmidt, or the 1,000 small tactical innovations that individual company commanders invented to keep their soldiers alive. Those stories didn't fit in the big narrative. Division advances X kilometers, Corps achieves Y objective. Army group secures Z sector, the grand strategy, the sweep of history. But wars aren't won by divisions on maps, they're won by squads in ditches, by sergeants who know how to read terrain, by lieutenants willing to trust their NCOs, by soldiers who survive long enough to learn. MacDonald understood this. That's why he started writing a different kind of report. Not official. Not for division headquarters, personal, for himself, for the men who'd been there. He wrote about Sergeant Gonsalves crawling through that culvert, about Private Carlson shivering in the frozen grass, about Corporal Stevens, who died in the first 11 minutes of the Marode assault. He wrote about fear and cold and confusion and the small moments of competence that kept men alive. He wrote because forgetting felt like betrayal, and he was 22 years old with 34 names that needed to be remembered. Charles MacDonald sat in a Pittsburgh apartment with a typewriter and a stack of notebooks. Civilian life now, 2 years since the war ended, 2 years of trying to be normal again. College on the GI Bill, classes about literature and history and philosophy, but at night he still saw the drainage ditch, still heard German voices in the darkness, still felt the weight of decisions made in frozen fields. So he wrote, not reports this time, a book. He called it Company Commander. It took him 8 months to write. Every page a memory, every chapter a battle. He wrote about leading men into combat at age 21, about making life and death decisions before he was old enough to legally buy a drink. He wrote about the drainage ditch, about Marode, about the tactical innovations born of desperation. But mostly he wrote about the cost, the boys who didn't come home, the letters to parents, the weight of command. He didn't glorify it, didn't make it heroic or noble or clean. He wrote it honest, the way it was, mud and fear and cold. Courage and competence mixed with confusion and chaos. Good men dying for reasons that seemed important at the time and meaningless later. The book was published in 1947. It didn't become a bestseller. Didn't make him famous, but it was read by veterans who recognized the truth in it, by officers who used it to train the next generation, by historians who understood that this was what combat actually looked like, stripped of propaganda and polish. MacDonald had given Company I one more thing. He'd made sure they weren't forgotten. September 1956, MacDonald returned to the Hürtgen Forest for the first time since the war. He was 34 now, major in the U.S. Army Reserve, chief historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. His job was to write the official history of the European campaign. But this trip was personal. He walked the ground where Company I had fought. The fields around Marode, the tree lines, the places where men had died. The drainage ditch was still there, overgrown now, peaceful, just a minor agricultural feature in German farmland. Nothing about it suggested that 98 American soldiers had moved through it on a frozen December night. MacDonald stood there for a long time. Then he heard a voice, in English, but accented. You were here during the war. He turned, a German man, maybe 50 years old, well dressed, walking with a slight limp. Yes, MacDonald said. The man extended his hand. I was Oberst, 275th Infantry Division. I commanded a regiment in this sector. MacDonald shook his hand. 2 soldiers, different armies, different sides. Standing on the same ground where they tried to kill each other 11 years ago. They walked together, the officer pointing out where his positions had been. MacDonald explaining the American approach. "We never saw you coming," the officer said. "Our maps showed no route from that direction." "I know," MacDonald replied. "That's why we used it." He nodded slowly. "In hindsight, we were too rigid. The Prussian tradition, precision, doctrine, it served us well in open warfare. But in that forest—" He trailed off. MacDonald finished the thought. "In the forest, you needed flexibility. We had it. You didn't. Not until too late," he agreed. "By the time we understood what you were doing, we lacked the resources to counter it properly." They stood in silence for a moment. Then the German officer said something that MacDonald would remember for the rest of his life. "Your sergeants were better prepared for that kind of fighting than ours. Not because they were braver, not because they were better soldiers, but because they were taught to think for themselves. Our system produced excellent executors of plans. Your system produced excellent solvers of problems. In 1940, in France, our system was superior. But by 1944, in conditions like this, your system had the advantage." MacDonald thought about that. "Neither system was perfect," he finally said. He smiled, sad, knowing. "No. But both systems were good at producing dead young men. They parted ways an hour later. Cordial, respectful. 2 professional soldiers who understood that the real enemy wasn't each other. It was the war itself, and the institutional rigidities on both sides that made it costlier than it needed to be." The lesson MacDonald took from Hürtgen wasn't about Americans versus Germans. It was about doctrine versus reality. Every military in history eventually becomes doctrine-bound. It's natural, inevitable. You win victories using certain tactics. Those tactics become standard procedure. Standard procedure becomes institutional knowledge. Institutional knowledge becomes unchangeable doctrine. And then you face an enemy who doesn't care about your doctrine, or terrain that doesn't match your maps, or conditions that your training never anticipated. And men die because the system can't adapt fast enough. The Germans in 1944 were living through this. An army that had conquered Europe in 1940 using superior doctrine, now watching that same doctrine fail against enemies who fought differently. But here's what MacDonald understood. The Americans would face the same problem. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. An army always becomes what it defeated. Victorious systems ossify into doctrine. The next generation of officers learns from textbooks, not from frozen ditches, and the cycle begins again. Korea, 1950. American forces advancing in North Korea. Confident, technologically superior, following doctrine. Chinese forces attacking through mountains the Americans thought were impassable, using trails not marked on maps. Appearing from directions doctrine said they couldn't come from. The Americans, now doctrine-bound, suffered surprise attacks. The same way the Germans had been surprised in the Hürtgen Forest. 6 years. That's how long it took for the Americans to forget the lesson. Vietnam, 1965, 1973. American forces with superior firepower, better equipment, complete air superiority. Viet Cong using jungle trails, tunnel networks, local terrain knowledge. Avoiding American strengths, exploiting American assumptions about how battles should be fought. American commanders studying maps and aerial photos, Vietnamese fighters studying the actual ground. 20 years after the Hürtgen Forest, the roles had reversed completely. Now the Americans were the map-dependent force. The enemy was using terrain knowledge as a weapon. MacDonald watched Vietnam unfold. He was a senior historian by then, tried to remind people of the lessons. "Maps show what planners think is important," he wrote. "Soldiers must see what is actually there." Some people listened. Most didn't, because institutional memory fades. Every generation has to learn its own lessons, preferably before too many die teaching them. February 2022. Ukraine, Russian forces invade, superior numbers, better equipment, detailed military maps showing road networks and strategic positions. They advance down those roads, following doctrine, executing plans. Ukrainian forces use local knowledge, farm roads, forest trails, drainage systems. They attack from directions the Russian maps don't show. The pattern repeats: doctrine versus ground truth, map-dependent armies versus terrain-savvy defenders, technology versus local knowledge. 80 years after the Hürtgen Forest, the same lesson, because some truths about warfare don't change. Doesn't matter if you navigate by paper maps or GPS or satellite imagery. If you trust the technology more than your eyes, you're vulnerable. If your doctrine assumes the enemy will fight according to your expectations, you'll be surprised. If you forget that soldiers on the ground see things planners in headquarters don't, you'll pay for that forgetting. In blood. Always in blood. Charles MacDonald died in 1990, 67 years old, decorated veteran, respected historian. He'd spent 45 years after the war studying military history, writing, teaching, trying to preserve the lessons. But near the end of his life, he wrote something in his private journal. It was never published, but his family shared it later. I've spent my entire adult life studying war, trying to understand it, trying to extract lessons that might save lives in future conflicts. And I've concluded this: every lesson of war must be relearned. Every generation pays the price again. Not because soldiers are stupid, but because war is experiential. You can't really understand it from books, from lectures, from simulations. You understand it when you're 22 years old, standing in a frozen field, deciding whether to trust a map or trust your sergeants. You understand it when you write letters to parents about sons who won't come home. You understand it when you stand in a drainage ditch 11 years later, talking to the man who was trying to kill you, and realize you were both just boys following orders from systems that valued doctrine over lives. So I write, I document, I teach, not because I think it will prevent the next war or save the next generation from making mistakes, but because the boys who died in that forest deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, not as casualties in a campaign. As individuals who saw a problem, tried to solve it, and paid the price for their courage. That's all history really is. Remembering, honoring, bearing witness. The lessons will fade. They always do, but the name shouldn't. The drainage ditch at Marode is still there. You can visit it, walk the ground, see the terrain that MacDonald and his men crossed on that December night in 1944. There's no monument, no plaque, just farmland, peaceful, ordinary. But if you stand there and close your eyes, you can imagine it. 98 young men, most of them teenagers, moving through frozen darkness. Terrified, determined, trusting their captain, trusting their sergeants, trusting each other, going where the map said they couldn't go, and learning the oldest lesson of war: ground truth beats paper truth, every time, in every war, for every generation that has to learn it again. MacDonald's final words in Company Commander, written in 1947, when the memories were still fresh and the pain still raw: I learned that maps show where roads are. They don't show where soldiers can go, that the enemy's weakness is often where he feels strongest, in his assumptions, that young American soldiers, given trust and leadership, can solve problems that doctrine says are impossible. But I also learned that innovation and courage, while necessary, are not sufficient. Good men still die in bad terrain. Smart tactics reduce casualties but don't eliminate them. Every victory is paid for. Every advance costs something. That is the truth we must never forget. Not the tactical lessons. Those will fade and be rediscovered, but the human cost, the weight of command. The names of boys who trusted us to lead them and died because we did. We owe them memory. We owe them honesty. We owe them the truth, unvarnished and complete. That's why I wrote this book. For Stevens and Reardon and Thompson and DiMaggio and all the others. So they won't be forgotten. So their families will know they mattered. So future soldiers will understand what war actually costs, not what propaganda says it costs, what it really costs, everything. In 2024, the US Army Infantry School at Fort Moore, Georgia, still uses MacDonald's Company Commander as required reading. The tactical details have changed, the technology has evolved. The doctrine has been revised a dozen times, but the fundamental truth remains. Trust your NCOs, question your maps, see what's actually there, not what you expect to be there. And remember that every lesson in warfare is written in blood, usually the blood of young men who deserve better than to die teaching it, but who did their duty anyway. Because that's what soldiers do. In every war, in every generation, on every battlefield, they trust their leaders, they follow orders, they solve impossible problems with whatever tools they have. And some of them come home, and some of them stay in frozen fields and distant forests, forever 22 years old, forever remembered by the men who led them. forever honored in the stories we tell, about drainage ditches and off-map attacks, and the day 98 American soldiers proved that courage and cleverness could defeat superior positions. For one night, in one battle, at a cost we still count, in names we must never forget,